We'll get going. So, hello everyone, and welcome to the first Armchair Travel of 2025. It's lovely to see you all. This event is in collaboration with Peter Summer Travels, who joined the Alumni Travel Programme last year, running a successful tour to Hadrian's Wall. This evening, I'm delighted to introduce and welcome our guest speaker, Paul Beston. Paul will be accompanying Julian Richards on our Explore Wessex tour and has a keen interest in Latin, that's incorrect, late antiquities, Roman Britain, and the Near East. Just to remind you, if you'd like to ask a question during this evening's talk, please could you use the Q&A function found at the bottom of your Zoom window. I'd now like to hand over to Michael from Peter Summer Travels.
Thank you very much indeed, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this armchair talk on behalf of Peter Summer Travels. We are an multi-award-winning UK-based tour operator specialised in creating cultural, archaeological, historical and gastronomic tours, either on traditional wooden vessels that cruise the coastlines and islands of Turkey, Greece, Croatia and Montenegro, or by chauffeur-driven small coach travel that explores discrete regions of these countries as well as those of Italy and the United Kingdom. Our narratives sweep from earliest prehistory to the present day, and we strive to reveal the geography, the people, the customs, and the food and wine of these magnificent places, alongside their history, their architecture, and their material culture. We had a great success with Cambridge alumni last year on our Exploring Hadrian's Wall itinerary, and this year we're offering a gastronomic tour of Eastern Sicily, as well as our wonderful Exploring Wessex. It's for the latter tour that we're gathered here today, and it's without further ado that I will hand you over to one of the scholars who will be your guides on this tour. The other Julian Richards, a British television and radio presenter, archaeologist and Stonehenge enthusiast, gave a brilliant talk about Stonehenge just 3 months ago. And tonight it is my distinct pleasure to welcome my great friend and colleague, Paul Beston, who is going to take us on a whirlwind tour of the other sites that we shall be visiting this July. Paul.
Okay, right, I guess I'll try and share. This is where the disasters begin. Let me just get my, there we go. There we go. Ooh. Actually, I don't want to do that yet at all, do I? Let's just have me. Well, hello. Always start with the disaster. Sorry for the slight nuclear explosion above my head. It's going to look like I'm having ideas every 20 seconds, but we tried it without the lights and had the sort of air of an early stage of the IPCRES files, and you'd all be revealing information to me. So this is a kind of compromise that we're going to attempt here. So yes, I'll go with the screen sharing now and let you know basically what the talk's about. Try and get the, can everyone see that clearly enough? I'll take that as a yes.
No, we can't see anything yet.
No, right. Claire, have you stopped sharing yours?
That's a very good point. There we go. Now try.
So we start off with a sort of appropriate image of Wessex here. This is a part of the site near Avebury, which is part of one of the avenues that lead into the great Neolithic complex there.
You need to share yours, Paul. We can see you, not the screen.
Yeah, come out of that. How's that doing? Yep.
Perfect.
Right. So, start again. So this is a nice stereotypical or ideal image of Wessex. Nice green fields with sarsen stones within them. And it exemplifies a large part of what I'll be talking about, at least the first half of the talk. The aim of this is to say, well, why come to Wessex? Why see it? What does it tell us about English history or the English story? What makes it a good place to come and spend a week? And it's sort of for several reasons. One is that it's a very good place to get an overview of all of English history, the sort of main points of the the various twists and turns of our story are very, very many represented here. You can see a lot of the types of sites that you talk about when you think about England's history. So cathedrals, castles, country homes, and of course the Neolithic beginnings, Roman sites, all that sort of stuff. So it's a great introduction if you're visiting, watching here tonight from somewhere that's not in England. If you don't know England well, then it's a great way to come into it. But of course, if you're English, especially if you're from another part of the British Isles, it's a great way to see a broad sweep of our history. The reason we chose Wessex as a title is kind of threefold. And that's because of the ways that Wessex has worked its way into our heads and into the English language. For someone like me, the prime reason, the first encounter with it was the archaeological one. Wessex has a very distinct and well understood meaning. It's an archaeological culture. When you say Wessex to an archaeologist, they know that you're going to be talking about the great monuments and the culture of the Neolithic and the Bronze Age in particular. So it's well understood from that point of view. And that's certainly a major strand of what we'll be looking at. The second one, of course, is the Kingdom of Wessex. This gradually came into being in the 5th and 6th centuries AD. It, as time went on, through vicissitudes of fighting with its neighbours in Mercia and elsewhere, came to dominate and came through the fire of the wars with the Vikings to, in the 10th and 11th centuries, dominate the whole of what would become England. And it's ultimately the organ that gives birth to the state that we're still living in today. So a lot of what we see in the early historical sites and so on in Wessex does have a huge impact for what's coming later on. And the third way that we refer to Wessex is because of the sort of intellectual, imaginary element, the way that Wessex appears in poetry and prose. And obviously, primarily, that's going to be Thomas Hardy, who lived here for much of his life, eventually took a house down outside Dorchester, and creates a lot of what we think of as Wessex, that idyllic, primarily a landscape where town and city are the real historical ones of the counties of Wessex as we know them, but transformed. And if you're thinking of Wessex, you're probably thinking of wild rolling hills with people in smocks wandering around them, and country lanes that wind hither and thither with who knows what coming down as you barrel down a narrow pathway in your pony and trap. So it's the combination of all of those three that really gives this its story. Now, the next thing we need to look at is obviously, having said Wessex, what do I specifically mean on the ground? Let's hope these now move forward. Yep, there we go. This is a map of the broad area that I'm talking about. So Wessex, in archaeological terms and in historical terms, does extend more widely, and indeed in the same with Hardy. There's much more to the south. Dorchester's cropped off this map. The reason we've confining the tour to the northwest is it gives us the best combination of historical periods. We can include the Neolithic, we can include the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, Roman, Anglo-Saxon, medieval, and later, in a way that isn't as simply possible elsewhere. So we have delimited in the north by the southern part of Gloucestershire, and then coming down around through Somerset into Wiltshire, and just heading towards the top of Hampshire and Dorset, down at the bottom part of the map there. So, as I say, it's an area filled with origin stories, places that mark the beginnings of major archaeological or historical phases, the story of England. And if we can go from the kind of macro end of things down to the very, very tiddly micro, it's where I slot into this story too. So as a late part of what I'll be talking about today, one of the events of the late 19th century is the way that the British Army moves into the area, which I'm kind of circling with the cursor here now, as part of the expansion program that they're initiating then. And they begin putting in a series of army camps across Salisbury Plain. And the first of those in 1895 is Tidworth, which is just down there, and they followed up with places like Lark Hill and Bulford. And they become, for the next 100 years, and still to a degree today, it marks Wessex and Salisbury Plain as a place where you will encounter the army. And that's how I came there. My father was a soldier, and I spent my early years in that area. And it was a very formative experience. First of all, and to give me an affinity and love of the landscape, which is very distinctive English landscape of, as I said, these great rolling chalk hills where the sky seems to go on forever. But also it brought me into direct contact with archaeology for the first time. So one of my first visits anywhere was Stonehenge. There was somewhere in existence a faded old photograph of a tiny me with the stone circle behind. But much more importantly was Avebury. It was a sort of class project we did, and it made my arms tingle. It was a fantastic introduction to this ancient world with these mysterious stones thrown up in this wide country, and then from the avenue intermingling with a medieval and later village. And there were all sorts of exciting stories about how they put the stones up, how nobody knew what they were for. And one particular one that stuck with me, the story of the unfortunate barber surgeon who in the 14th century, as the story went then, and I'll move on the pictures, was squashed flat by one of the sarsen stones toppling down on top of him and no one being able to pull him out. And that's the end of him, as the children's stories would go. So this made archaeology, the great depth of time and the distinctive Neolithic story and Bronze Age story of Wessex really interesting to me. And although we ultimately moved away from Wessex to various other pastures with the army, Wessex stayed with me, and I was able to come back to it eventually and do more research on it because of the job that I eventually came to, which it is in large part responsible for me taking the route to. The other thing about Wessex is the way, as someone who's been involved with ancient history and archaeology for a large part of my life, you get some of the big names here. It's a veritable kind of supergroup of names associated with it. You'll find William Stukeley here, although you tend to find him everywhere. He's a very busy man. Richard Colt Hoare, Pitt Rivers, William and Maud Cunnington, OGS Crawford, Alexander Keeler. If you really wanted to, you could throw in the Duke of Buckingham, Inigo Jones, and Charles Darwin at various points. If you go to, I think it's the Cedric in Cambridge, you'll see some of Darwin's connections with Wessex in one of the small finds. Very hard to spot, but it is there. And occasionally, other more odd things like a weasel will be finding sites for you. There are major sites that are nationally and internationally important. Pioneering archaeologists, like I say. So it's another great attraction of this place. The third, as you can see in the picture, is the landscape. It's a phenomenally beautiful part of the country. Now, Wessex is a bit more varied than what I will have at the core of what we're talking about here. So if you went to the fringes of Gloucestershire, for example, you've got these deep, dark combes that seem to make tunnels out of trees everywhere and some quite exciting driving. You've got the downs on the south coast and the wetlands, say around the Bristol Channel, which once extended much more extensively so that you could come by boat all the way as far as Glastonbury. But the core of it for me is always the bit that I spent time in as a child, and that's the chalk uplands and the area around Salisbury Plain that you can see here that creates this enormously smooth rolling landscape. The chalk in places like Avebury is a good 210 meters deep. It's formed something like 70 to 100 million years ago, and it creates a very gentle looking landscape. And in places, it also allows a certain amount of twisting in the landscape that seems to be almost impossible using sort of normal geography, but it creates these impressive, beautiful vistas of rising and falling, always rising and falling landscape going off into the distance. That landscape is always peppered with something ancient if you know where to look. An example, if I zoom in, you see down here, we have a dolmen, part of a burial monument from something like 3,500, 4,000 years ago. And there are lots more in the area around there. So this is taken just a little bit to the west of Avebury, in between Avebury and Marlborough. And there are a lot of other monuments in the area around there. So it's famously a place of hamlets and villages where there are good pubs in between, and we take full advantage of that while we're there. And it's got this reputation for having something like a timeless feel. It's a place that time has forgotten. And it looks like that when you look at photographs like these. This is again near Avebury. That tree, the area around there conceals some Bronze Age barrows and some Anglo-Saxon stuff around there as well. And it does genuinely have this feel of ancientness, but that is, although that's something you'll feel as you're passing between barrows and hill forts and so on, it is a little bit artificial. This is a landscape that's changed constantly throughout history, and although it does look extremely ancient, it is really a product of the 18th to sort of 19th centuries. But everything that's been there before is written in. It's there to be found if you know where to look, or if you have someone with you who can tell you where to look. And that brings me to the next part of it, which is the way that this landscape, because it has been written on so many times, becomes a kind of palimpsest. You can see the physical remains of the history of many, many periods written in over and over again, and one monument will be demolished or adapted or repurposed and gain different meanings over different phases of time, but there will always be something left of the original thing, whether it be a sarsen stone in a cottage wall, or the different marks on, as we'll see, some of the Neolithic buildings. So you can take, for example, Stonehenge. Stonehenge famously is a Neolithic to Bronze Age monument, but there is material around there. The earliest occupation of the site, the earliest evidence of human activity, goes back to the Mesolithic, way before, by some thousands of years. The sites that you familiarly associated with it. There is Roman activity there and Anglo-Saxon. It seems to be the Anglo-Saxon activity there that gives it the name that we're familiar with. Sorry, just move on a wee bit. There we go. And among the later activity is some stuff that's not always easy to see. This is a thrilling and exciting picture, I'm sure we can all agree, and doesn't seem to show anything. But if you kind of refocus your eyes towards the center and look at this area, you'll see what I'm about to get at. This is one of the great sarsen stones at Stonehenge in the core of the site, the great circle there. So this is one of the trilithons standing huge and upright there since, we're now talking 4,000 odd years. And these are very faint carvings of some daggers. And they were made in the period something like 1800 to 1500 BC, at which point the great circle that we know is, shall we say, about 500 years old, depending on your dating. But they weren't found until the 1950s, when a particularly sharp-eyed archaeologist just happened to be basically walking past. The light was right, and there they were. And it tells us the story of how Stonehenge is reused. Its original religious ritual purpose, however you want to define it, has changed, but people were still now coming in and commemorating themselves in different ways on it. But those things can be hard to find, as this indeed was. Now, there's a couple marked there, but we now know through things like laser scanning that there's at least 115 of those marked on various trilithons around the center of the site. And they are impossible to see unless you know they're there and someone can point out where they are. It's a good marker of why having a book or a guide or something like that with you is very helpful. Similarly, as a later example of some people coming up to the stones and making their mark, we have, once again, another exciting picture. I specialize in these, of one of the trilithons. And you can see, if you look through the lichens here, at the center, there is some carving in. And what we have is a cross, where my cursor is now, if you can see that, and then the name Wren. And there's a couple of these on the stones, and it is thought, although we can never prove it, that this is Christopher Wren, who was the architect who was a schoolboy nearby, does some work later on Salisbury Cathedral, for example, when he's obviously grown. But here, a youthful indicator of his first encounter with big stone constructions. In terms of other reuse of buildings, this is an area near Avebury, and we have some barrows. There's a whole line of these in this rather lovely countryside, which goes across the road. These begin in the Bronze Age, but there are also Roman ones in the very same line. And in the last phase of it, you get Anglo-Saxon burials put in them as well. We could also talk about the later influence of Stonehenge here. Very clear and doesn't need really any explanation, I'm sure you'll agree. This is the circus at Bath. Very fine Georgian construction, beautiful set of houses, with some very famous residents in their time. But actually the design of it is a combination of influences and restatements of history from Wessex and its encounters with the wider world. So the size of the circus here is intended to reflect the diameter of Stonehenge. And the decoration, you can see these finials up here in the shape of acorns, is a reference to medieval legends about the son of Lud Hudibras, future king Bladud or Bladud, who comes here and is cured in the wonderful waters of Roman Bath, or what would be Roman Bath, after he discovers his pigs getting a good cleanup by descending into the muddy waters when he has leprosy. There are also, not quite so easily visible, but there's a whole series of metopes around here with lots of very mysterious, hard to read, not fully understood references to ritual, mythological, magical, arcane elements. And this is another thing that Stonehenge and Wessex in general tends to provoke, a kind of speculative side of life, if you like. So you'll all be familiar with the kind of countercultural things that linked particularly with Stonehenge, but it's something you see in the 18th century as well. It tends to send people a little bit off their rocker, if you like. And then finally, I know someone's asked about Old Sarum here. Sorry, it's a slightly smaller picture. This is from English Heritage. Just showing you again how a site can be a palimpsest, how it can be reused. This is the site of Old Sarum, just outside Salisbury. You can see it's basically a sort of squashed teardrop shape. Well, that bit I've just encircled, that is an Iron Age hill fort. So we're talking about, say, the 400s, 300s BC there, down to, well, it's certainly still occupied by about 100 BC and a bit later. That becomes, when the Romans get here, there's still a town, an occupation from the locals attached to it, but that becomes a Roman town as time goes on, and there's a Roman road built right next to it. When that goes out of use, we then have Anglo-Saxon occupation, and one of the early battles related to the creation of Wessex is fought right by this site in 552. And then with the Norman conquest, much later, you get the insertion of two great elements. So at the center, you can see this deep ditch is dug as a motte, and a castle and high status residence is put in. And then in this rather squished site here, we have the old Sarum Cathedral, the one that would ultimately be replaced by New Sarum or Salisbury in 1220. So that's put in on this very tight site, and in the area, which here just looks perfectly flat and green, nothing to see here, an entire town develops there and expands further out. Once all that's out of use in the 16th century, the whole thing turns into a rotten borough until the Great Reform Act of 1832. So in that small space, you've got an immense amount of British history being enacted and reenacted. So that's the preamble. Now for a skitter through the various periods of history here. Just tailing off with a sort of last one about the inspiration side of it. This is that dolmen that we were looking at earlier that ultimately formed the basis of a very short story, a very gothic short murder story by Thomas Hardy. But onto our periods. So I'll go through relatively quickly here, just show you the sort of nice things you can see from those ages with some hopefully interesting pics. So the Neolithic, which we're talking about, is sort of 4000 BC onwards, sorry, 3000 BC onwards. and 4000 to 3000 BC, brains in gear. And in Wessex, we have probably the most perfect example of the major sites that are associated in people's memories with it. Now, that's not to say, and none of this is to say that this is the only British history we could have. Northumberland and Cumbria and other parts of England have very different histories. But this, because of the combination of archaeology, because Wessex becomes the core of England, because so much of the literature is written about this region, becomes the kind of the type site, if you like, the defining benchmark. But it's one you can use as your starter for English history and then go on to explore other regions. How does the Neolithic period work here? Well, one thing we're blessed with is a lot of relatively easy to find archaeology. And one reason for that is the combination of the terrain, where the earthworks tend to show up very well on the chalk and rolling hills, but also the existence of what we're looking at here. These are sarsen stones in their natural state. These are the big stones that end up being the trilithons at Stonehenge, the great stones at Avebury, and the stones that are incorporated into so many other monuments. This is a drift, a so-called drift of these just off to the east of Avebury, and it's how they would have been naturally found. And we can also see why they get their nickname. They're often called the grey wethers because they look like sheep that are sort of lying down. And if you look at the real sheep there, once you get past a certain distance, it's a little bit hard to tell the difference between the two. There are very few of these left now. This one has, I think, about 20,000 stones in it. But this is just a small fraction of what still existed, even as late as sort of 1885. But there was a big industry then for these to be broken up, turned into hardcore and various other things. But they are magical spots to walk through. And I know at least one of you has asked a question about walking. You could certainly take a detour or start your walk around here and get a full sense of the landscape by beginning of this area. The Neolithic also gives us our first tools that we're looking at and our first encounters with people. These are the sorts of tools that were mentioned in my schoolboy story. These are the deer antlers that were used to dig out the great ditches, the enormous 10-meter ditches in places that were used to form the henge monuments, and not with this sort of hacking action, basically like a lever. But these survive in very great quantities because they're often deposited very carefully in the ditch when people move on and the site is built. I'm going to look at three sites in particular, two in a slightly more detailed than others. But the first one is the first site we go to on our tour, and one of my personal favourites and one of the most evocative. This is West Kennet Long Barrow, just the south of Avebury, and it's a very large and very early tomb. This dates to the 37th century BC. Its first phase is something like 3675 to 3650 or 25. And it's a huge, long chalk mound with at its nearby end a series of chambers in which are deposited a considerable number of people. Initially in its first phase, which goes for about 100 years, I think it's something like 50 odd people or 75 people, ranging in age from 3 to 50. But not buried in any very careful, at least in our sense, way. They are stored in sorted and collected, curated collections of bones. So you'll find lots of arm bones together and so on. You'll find the bodies partly grouped in by age and sex in some places. And at West Kennet and other burial places around here, you'll sometimes find bones that are clearly just a single bone left from a body, and they can be found some distance from where they actually were living. It seems that bits of bones are exchanged between local communities at that time, possibly as a way of saying we have strong connections. You are a friendly community to us. And this sort of curation happens not just with people. There are cattle bones at Stonehenge, for example, buried in the ditch there, that were 300 years old when they were put in. Why? Well, let me know, and I'll see if I can get someone to publish it. West Kennet stands just above Silbury Hill here, which is a monument from about 1,000 years later, when the Neolithic, as we know it in terms of the famous monuments, is much more underway. It's the era of the henge monuments. Now, its exact date is a little bit unclear, but we're talking about the mid-2000s BC, and that is an entirely artificial mound made of heaped chalk and various other things at the centre, and a part of the much wider landscape at Avebury. So one of the things to bear in mind about these great big Neolithic sites is it's not just Stonehenge. It is not just the henge at Avebury. They are the centre of a huge writing upon a wide landscape, done and redone over very many centuries, for differing and often obscure purposes, involving like processions, gatherings together. And this one is just a small part of the Avebury World Heritage Site. Avebury's sort of out of sight up to the right, sort of centre right up there. That's just a final view of West Kennet with the sarsen stones around its portal, which is eventually closed, seemingly with care, to mark the end of that phase of life, maybe ideas about the dead of change, because this is the era where the henge monuments are coming in, and they seem to be, at least in their earlier period, associated with burial and death. The nearest one is Avebury, which you can see here. This is the entry that you get into from the famed avenue, which links it to another part of this wide site. And you can see how it's very different to Stonehenge. It's linked in with the wider town, and it has these enormous stones that are very different to the trilithons at Stonehenge, very much liked by the sheep around there, like to rub up against them. And some of them are enormous. Many of the stones here weigh 20, 30 tons. The very largest ones up to 100. So it's a site that really impresses you with the skills and ability and labor of the Neolithic workers here, and makes it really something we'd like to know why they were doing it. It's not so much of this still remains obscure. All we can do is look on and wonder for a lot of it. And then that's all linked together by this enormous avenue linking it to another part of the site called the Sanctuary. And it's a very evocative landscape, as I'm sure you'll agree. We can also, as I say, because of these places being associated with burial, meet some of the people involved. This is a chap buried under Winterbourne Stoke, Long Barrow, fairly early on in the period. But we can encounter these people and learn a lot, not just from what they're buried with, as you can see with the Beaker burial here from, I think it's near Bush Barrow, southwest of Stonehenge, but also a lot about their daily life. So from their teeth and their bones, we can learn about their physical activity, and often it's very surprising. We can learn, for example, that the Amesbury archer, he seems to have spent his childhood somewhere in the Alps. So the contacts that these people had are much wider than you might have imagined. Another rather famous burial here. This is an archer who was buried in the ditch at Stonehenge before, or at least at the period where the great stones are going up. So say 2400 to 2200 BC. A young man, fairly physically fit. His bones at the shoulders especially tell us he's very strong, done a lot of hard work, maybe raising the stones, a lot of people like to think. But if you look closely, you can see here's one of his rib bones, which has just been moved out of position, and it and several others, you can see they've been laid out by the side of the body here, all have notches and markers on them. And one of them has the tip of an arrow embedded in. And that seems to be a marker of his violent death. I mean, it certainly is a marker of his violent death. What has happened is he's had an arrow coming in from his right-hand side. It has penetrated his body, and it has rebounded off several of his ribs, and then ultimately piercing his heart, gone through and only been stopped by his sternum. So I'm afraid the idea that this might be an idyllic era where peace and harmony and astrology, if you like, reigned, if you're into that sort of 60s counterculture thing. No, there's definitely a lot of violence going on as well. And then we have things like the houses that they were living in at Durrington, which are visible at the rather lovely Stonehenge Visitor Centre. I'm not going to talk in detail about Stonehenge. I'm just going to say that one of the things we do on the tour is get access to the centre of it. And we either go in the period around dawn or dusk, and they create very different pictures. And it's a very different experience to just walking around the outside as most visitors do today, who cannot enter this central section. It's an enormously evocative experience. So this is the nighttime one, and I this is the one I did first, and it's enormously impressive. And I thought that would be the best, but when I did Dawn on a day like this, and look at that. It's a fantastic place, and you can see how close other parts of the historical landscape are as well. So over here, we have the first of the barrows that when the monuments go out of use in their initial mode, with the period around 2000, 1800 BC, what you see is the area around it, which had been kept kind of clear of other monuments up until then, is colonized. Barrows start skittering in the under the cover of night, and burials are made closer in association with this very, very ancient already monument. And you start to see in the period of the earlier second millennium BC some very rich burials being made. This one is from Bush Barrow near Stonehenge, and it's pure gold in size. And that's only a small part of the wonders that were found in that barrow. As time goes on, the landscape, which had already been farmed in the Neolithic, that's the period where all this begins, becomes less sacred around Stonehenge and Avebury and elsewhere, and you start to see it being divided up. Farmland plots emerge, and you get a move from those sort of very communal burials of the early Neolithic to very rich burials of the sort you see with Bush Barrow there, and a greater indication that society is taking on a more sort of hierarchical aspect and developing more formality. And that continues on through the Iron Age. So you see the emergence in Wessex then of a great culture of hill forts being built, which begin with a scatter of relatively small ones, but as time goes on, you see supersized ones emerging, most famously at Maiden Castle. And at the end of that phase, as the hill forts go out of use, we start to see contacts with the rest of Europe, as we can read them literally here through Greek and Roman authors. And by the mid part of the 1st century BC, we can see that trading is happening on a regular basis with the continent, and we can start to see the emergence of actual tribal, almost states emerging in Wessex. So you have the tribes of the Dubuni, the Durotriges, and in the east, a slightly more messy picture, but we can talk about that later if anyone wants to. The reason I put this in, by the way, it's not quite from our area, it's just outside near Chichester, but someone did ask about that transitional period, and this is the most exciting recent find from that era, and I just had to put it in because the helmet is the most exciting one I've seen from the Iron Age ever. It's fantastic, crazy. So that brings us to the Romans, and our Roman sites I'll take us through relatively briefly. This is obviously the most famous of them, Roman Bath. We're looking here from the top of the Abbey. And what you see is the emergence after the initial Roman conquest, which is done relatively quickly. We know that it's done really in about a year, 2 years. And the Second Legion comes stomping across from its landing ground, wherever that was. There are 2 possibilities. And under the future Emperor Vespasian, it just takes all those enormous hill forts and sweeps them aside, and very, very quickly peace and order is imposed here. Within 30 years, you have the emergence of a recognizably Romano-British lifestyle. The Romans don't enslave everybody, they don't oppress everybody and the worst kind of way. What they do, as they do everywhere, is they work with the local aristocracy, get them to govern everything, and the Romans are able to basically do empire on the cheap. So there's no real desire on their part to impose ways of thinking on them. And indeed, they're quite happy to accept local gods, and that's what's going on here. Bath has 3 natural springs, with water spending about 6,000 years coming from the Mendips and emerging here various temperatures in the mid-40s degrees range, and it creates this very mineral-rich, extraordinary gushing series of natural springs that were marvels certainly to the Iron Age people, and they were worshipping here and making offerings here at the natural sites. And then the Romans come along and they quite happily worship at the same places too, and they interpret the gods, say, well, this is basically the same sort of deity we worship, and they don't exclude the Celtic version at all. What they do is monumentalize the whole place. So around the original shrine, the original spring, they build a revetment and a temple, which is under the area I'm sort of circling now. And then they build a great Roman bath, much bigger and more impressive than the other kinds of Roman baths you get elsewhere, even in the legionary fortresses, because it has this sort of swimming pool-sized bath at the center of it. And this is all a combination of religious and health spa kind of function for the whole place. This is the original spring. You can't really see it, but this water is visibly bubbling up as you look there, and it comes out through this gushing spring here and is then taken by lead pipes into the main bathhouse here. And there are subsidiary baths. There are, being the Romans, places where you can have exercise and wrestling and all sorts of things going on as well. And within that, you see the Romans taking the local cult and Romanizing it as well. So they have statues here of what they seem to think is the equivalent of the local deity. So Minerva here is worshipped as Sulis Minerva. And the whole site becomes called Aquae Sulis. This is a gilt bronze head found in the 1720s, just outside the assembly rooms when work was going on for the Georgian city. And it may be the cult statue. It's a bit small for that, but it could be. And then you have a temple built by there, which had this. Sorry, a bit of a longer look there. Not too quickly on that. And then we have this, which was on the pediment of a temple very close by, which traditionally was called the Gorgon, though it suffers from the fact that it's quite clearly male, and no one really calls it that anymore. But exactly what it is unclear. It's got wings either side of its head. It's got snakes coming out of its hair. And there are other bits of imagery that you can't quite see there that mark it out as something quite peculiar, associated with Minerva. But what is going on exactly? We could possibly talk about that in the questions later on if anyone's interested. That's it in the slightly wider view. You can see victories on either side of it there, just in that bit there. And there are globes and Greek helmets and all sorts of things going on. Local deities are being worshipped, but they're worshipped again in that Roman style. So what we have here is an image of Mercury. You can see from his staff in his hand. But Mercury in the rest of the Roman world isn't shown like this, because he's got next to him Mrs. Mercury, or Rosmerta, who's there with her bucket. And you often find a goose associated with this as well. This is an example of this blending of Roman and local religions that happens very much in Wessex generally. It's a phenomenon around Roman Britain, but there's some really good examples of it here, including these who look like aliens from Roswell. This is the three matres who are found very commonly in the Cotswolds. It's their main sort of focus area in all of Britain. And the sort of fire that you get from this area is the curse tablets, so-called, which I can in the questions probably read out some of these to just give you an indication. But basically, they're very bloodthirsty invocations to the goddess to destroy, obliterate, and variously flatten people who've done something so awful as to nick a cloak. They're good indicators of the social world of that 1st to 4th century AD. We also visit Roman Corinium, but I'll move on instead to here, our final Roman site, and that's Chedworth Villa, which is an enormous villa concealed in the Cotswolds in still a very out-of-the-way place, one of the largest villas in Roman Britain. And it is filled with mosaics here. Sorry about the slightly duff picture, but it's all I could find in the time I had, but a very high quality one, because around Cirencester, Corinium, which is one of the largest towns in Roman Britain, a huge mosaic industry grows up, and this is an example of their craft. You can see some of the, although this is a very high status villa with dining rooms, huge suites of baths, lots and lots of opulent dwelling rooms and so on, a huge structure generally. Even so, you've got some very rudimentary, shall we say, images of deities. This one is possibly Lenus Mars, and this one may be Cuda, who is a goddess who possibly gives her name to the Cotswolds, but she's clearly just stepped out of the bath and hasn't dried her hair yet. And the latterly, Chedworth and Bath both have evidence for Christianity. Roman Christianity as the empire begins to change religion. But that, of course, all comes to a sort of a hiatus with the next development that happens in the 5th century, the end of the Roman Empire, and the emergence of the Anglo-Saxons coming in from the south coast and from the Thames Valley. Now, there's lots of obviously Anglo-Saxon history here. There's some really important early burials, cemeteries. There's literary evidence in the form of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle telling us about the landing of Sinrich. We've got lots of details about their progression west and creating the Kingdom of Wessex. But there's not so much visible above ground in terms of buildings, at least for this early period. So I'm just going to confine us to this example of the sort of thing I'm talking about. This dates to a period after the expansion west of Wessex in the 6th century. In the 570s, they occupy the area around Cirencester and Bath and Gloucester. And in the century afterwards, you see some very fine burials like this as Wessex begins to solidify as a kingdom. This is the so-called Swallow Cliff Princess. She's buried on a bed. You can see the fittings of it, this long lines here. Which possibly means the body was exposed, and she's got some rich grave goods, lots of nice vessels, glass jars. You've got a yew tree bucket here with iron fittings, which is possibly to do with pagan religion. But she's also got this rather Roman-looking open work disc brooch, which may have Christian connotations. So she's kind of falling between two worlds there. And she may also be falling in between the worlds of English and Britain or Celt, because a lot of these burials do seem to have things that belong to both cultures. So it's hard at some stages to say what someone's language would have been, for example, just from the physical remains of them or where their body is found. The march west, if you like, of the Anglo-Saxons is not in terms of a front line. It becomes a place where patches and elements of British culture are left behind. Avebury, for example, its early name is Ditch, the ditch or the ramparts of the Britons. So they're left as a small British village in an area that's becoming increasingly Anglo-Saxon and English. Now, leave that one out there. We're moving on into the medieval period now, and this we illustrate in two ways. We've got some great churches to look at. The one you're looking at there is Old Sarum from ground level. That's the remnants of what was once a great cathedral, but it just shows you how even a huge building can be picked clean if the stone is sufficiently valuable to someone. And most of this ends up being carted quite literally out through the entrance of the old hill fort and down to create Salisbury nearby. We have Wells here, a end of the 12th, early 13th century foundation. And one of the things we look at in particular is the really charming sculpture that's inside. You've got lots of images of men like this fella on the piers here. A huge number of people with toothache. He's grasping his mouth and looking quite in pain there. Or you've got images of life, market stalls, people stealing apples, and so on and so on. Or waiting for to be seen in the chapt house, the center of the building, and they're so bored they're waiting. They're making little board games. They can see a little grid scratched out to play something while the abbot is ready to come summon them in. You also have decoration like this at Salisbury. This is the chapter house at Salisbury, and you can see lots of cycles here from the first books of the Bible. So you have the angels visiting Lot. Moses, sorry, here you see Sodom and Gomorrah being destroyed, and over here you see the Israelites trooping out with the Lot and the others who listened to advice, doing very well, but poor old Lot's wife there about to be turned into a condiment. And there's Salisbury itself, if you're not hugely familiar or a Russian spy or something. And our final thing from the medieval, or set of sites from the medieval period is some castles. This is Berkeley, which was also on our original image here. And we have a range of sites here which can really give us lots of insight into hugely important events of the Middle Ages. So Old Sarum, There we have in 1086 the Oath of Sarum, by which basically every knight swears allegiance to William, creating a much more strongly organized, centralized state. We have here at Berkeley the site of the murder of Edward II. We have here at Wells the development of an ordered, organized series of monasteries and churches with huge estates. And this one left here, this is the Vicar's Close in Wells. This is the best preserved, most complete medieval street in England. It's largely mid-14th century. There's a couple of bits that are a bit later, like the garden walls, if you like, but that is as complete as you're likely to get. I'll just skip through a bit here, so because I think we're running a bit out of time. That's Wells. Wells also very impressive for this huge set of scissor arches, because like a lot of these sites, they're built on something that's hard to sustain the weight above them. Salisbury is very similar. They've got 60,000 tons of stone alone there. I think there's something like 1,200 tons of oak, and yet they built it on effectively a marsh. So it also needs scissor arches like this. Scoot on because I think time is moving. And then, yes, as our final of one of the great churches, we have Glastonbury here, which again has this enormously long history. There is Neolithic occupation here. There's more intensive Roman occupation here, possibly a shrine. We have Irish Celtic occupation here in the sub-Roman period. There's possibly a monastery here. With people coming directly from Ireland and communicating with the local Britons. And then that's replaced by an Anglo-Saxon monastery, which is in turn replaced by a Norman, very finely beautiful one, which has links, and I know some people have asked about this, obviously to King Arthur, although those links aren't really invented until the 12th century AD. And as our final castle here, we have Sudeley, which also has links to the wider story of English history. This is a marker of how by the 15th century, the old style of castle is less necessary, seemingly, because England is not a fort over land. So you start to see castles transmuting into country homes, as this one very much is doing at the hands of the Boteler family in the 15th century. It turns out to be a sort of a false dawn, because, of course, in the 15th century, as you'll know, you get the Wars of the Roses, and through the vicissitudes of that, this comes also into the hands of Richard III, or the future Richard III, who builds this section. But you can see that the move is well on the way to becoming the sort of country house. And it carries on linking itself into the wider story of English history here. So we have most particularly the dwelling for a time here of Catherine Parr, who's the one of Henry VIII's wives who escapes. And it always ends triumphantly with survived, but nobody ever mentions the second part of the story after that, which is much sadder, because she ends up marrying someone she clearly had been in love with forever, Thomas Seymour, brother of the Lord Protector Somerset, who is one of the oiliest and least attractive figures in the 16th century. For a while, seems to be moving in on the young Princess Elizabeth, but in the aftermath of that causing a scandal, they move out here, and it's here shortly after giving birth that poor Catherine Parr dies, only a few years after Henry himself. And she's actually buried in the really charming church you can see there on the left. Her body was rediscovered in the 18th century and then rehoused in a much more grand tomb in the 19th. The only, as far as I'm aware, and this is certainly what the locals claim, the only private house burial of an English queen. And you can see the gardens are very beautiful. So we're certainly well on the way to country house by this point. And then finally, you have Bath there of our medieval sites. But again, as time is slightly moving on, I will skedaddle up the ladder. And I think I should probably end about there. How does that sound? Yes, I think that's probably a sensible idea. Right, I will unshare.
Thank you very much for that, Paul. That was an incredible journey through the landscape of Wessex. Landscape and chronology. We have, unsurprisingly, quite a few questions have been coming in as you were going. I will come to them in a second. I just wanted to start with my own, and then I'll pull them all together and start working through them. But one of the things that I was always fascinated by the part of Wessex that you've chosen to focus on in this talk is that we don't actually see any coastlines, as you said, when we go through this, but there's an incredible connection with water all the way
Yes.
through
Yeah,
this.
I mean, obviously Wessex has a maritime history. The Portsmouth, Southampton are major parts of its um, historical development. You know, you get to Hanwich developing in the 9th century, the 10th century becomes Southampton. But yeah, one thing that does strike me about this is water comes back, and by this I mean inland water, all the way through the history of and archaeology of Wessex. So Silbury, that site I showed you earlier on, the artificial mound, next to that there are what called the Swallowhead Springs, which are a natural spring which ultimately creates the River Kennet, and the Kennet flows into the Thames. And that seems to be one of the things that attracted people to these original Neolithic sites. You find them often bounded by rivers to east and west, and often by natural springs like this, places where water appears out of the ground in this strange fashion. Silbury, which you saw there, is when the water table is high, often cut off, surrounded by water, as if it is an island in a lake. Even Avebury, as has recently been proved in the last sort of generation or so, if the water table there is sufficiently high, because it has that enormously deep ditch, it too seems to be separated off from the wider world. And then if you go further on, in the Iron Age, you've got the depositions in water. Water is clearly a place where you obviously it's the foundation of life and so on, but it's a place where you meet and encounter or give things to the gods through the Iron Age. And that, as we saw with Bath, is latched onto by the Romans. They're picking up an Iron Age water cult, adding things to it themselves. And it carries on into the medieval. So Glastonbury, you've got a water cult there, partly based on the springs and shrines, one of which may be Roman in origin. Wells Cathedral there. Well, Wells gets its name because there are wells everywhere. It's and Chedworth has its own natural spring there. Chedworth, if anyone wants to talk about villas, is an example of one of these villas that are odd, and it may actually be more shrine than villa, related to a water cult in the angle of the main part of the villa buildings there. And obviously, if we get them full circle, you go to Bath, and what are people doing? They're bathing in water, drinking it, and going, this tastes funny. But they're gathering at these places because of water over and over again. If there's an overarching theme that you can keep coming back to on this trip, it's that for me. It really does strike you more than it does elsewhere.
Yes, it's a very unexpected one for many of us to see, but it's a very much a recurrent theme that you see there. We've had you mentioned Avebury and the water and the landscape that could possibly appear there and separate it slightly. And we've actually been asked a question: is there evidence for a connection between the site at Avebury and Stonehenge, and can the route be walked?
Yes, on both counts. The former one, not maybe in a massive way. As I said, these Neolithic sites are not just the core henge sites. They are complexes, lots of buildings around them. So Avebury, you have the avenues, coves, and there's the causewayed camps, and so on that create these enormous expanses of landscape with monuments on them. Stonehenge has the same thing with Woodhenge and Blue Stonehenge and Durrington Walls, and much more, as recent discoveries show as well. And they are generally arranged in similar ways with similar combinations of things. And that's not just applying to those two, because there are more, of course, as well. These are just the two most visible. Dorchester, down on the south, or near the south coast, near Maiden Castle, had exactly the same thing going on. I mentioned Thomas Hardy. His house, though he didn't know it at the time, he'd have loved to have discovered this, is on some sort of hengiform monument. There's another big henge next to him, his house, 5 minutes walk away, at Mount Pleasant. And there are buildings in Dorchester itself, which are very much of the sort that you'd expect to see in the complex at somewhere like Stonehenge and Avebury. They're just effectively built on by the modern town, and we can't see them as well. Similarly at Marden and elsewhere. And the fact that these are all doing something in the same sort of way does suggest, yes, there are very common connections between them. It's a unified kind of culture. The view generally, I think, still is that these henge monuments and henge complexes mark regional territories where people are sort of living together, and they regard themselves as being from the same sort of place. I don't want to give a label to it above that because we don't know if we're talking chiefs or something more communal or whatever. But they do mark these zones, which have, yes, regular contact with each other. So there is that connection. As for walking, I haven't done the whole journey on foot myself, but I'm pretty sure it can be done. I think there's the Long Distance Walking Association have a map for this, and certainly if you start off at Avebury, you could visit the Devil's Den and those drifts that I was talking about. You could go down past Adam's Grave. There's some beautiful country there, real rolling, steep-sided hills, some fantastic pubs, canals, places where there are huge clusters of barrows. And you then come down to Durrington, where you have Durrington Walls, which is over the top of what seems to be the village where the people who built Stonehenge lived. That's what those reconstructed houses at Stonehenge site, the modern visitor centre, are based on. Some very extensive excavations there in the 60s. And then you could carry on to Stonehenge itself, past King Barrow Ridge, which is very evocative as a landscape, in the dip, coming roughly from the angle where Tess of the D'Urbervilles comes along at the end of towards the end of the Hardy story, see Stonehenge itself, and then ideally go over the road and see Normanton Down Barrows, because the views there, the landscape there is gorgeous. So yes, I haven't walked it all, but I think it would definitely be a rewarding prospect. It's about 26 miles.
Sounds absolutely fantastic. But talking about fantastic landscapes, we have another question here, which is, an anonymous attendee has asked, did the Kingdom of Wessex ever extend into Devon and Cornwall?
Yes. Yes. By the end of the 7th century, they were already on the fringes of Somerset and Devon. In the 8th and 9th century, they conquer right down to the end of the peninsula. It's a bit of a mysterious process. We do hear, for example, one Anglo-Saxon princess burning down Taunton for obscure reasons. We don't know anything much more about that. We do have very occasional details about fighting with what was the Kingdom of Dumnonia, which is basically the entire southwest peninsula. Very important Celtic kingdom, but archaeologically we can say very little about it because our evidence is largely the odd tombstone written with Latin, sometimes Ogham writing, and one or two references. We've got a King Geraint mentioned, for example, but the evidence is very flimsy. But yes, we do.
Excellent, excellent. Well, this is a slightly more off-piste one, perhaps. A gentleman by the name of Keith has asked two questions. The first of which is, there was an excellent 1970s children's TV series called Children of the Stones, based in Avebury. Do you know it? It strikes a vague bell for me, but I can't quite picture
I
it.
haven't rewatched all of it. I remember it, such bits as because it must have been reshown when I was a kid rather than the first showing. I think it's like 76 it came out. It was one of those very typical 70s TV dramas which were designed to terrify children. There's actually a book out called Scarred for Life, which I think that features in. So, yes, it's very evocative, very frightening, I'm sure.
One to look up on YouTube at some point, perhaps.
Yes, but, I think it is there, yeah.
Keith came back with a second one, which is the Oxford Dictionary of Place Names says that Chedworth is named after cheddar, but Cotswold's named after cod. Are they different people?
I think some of these, I don't know the date of that particular edition. To be honest, a lot of these obscure place names, they tend to get explained by Anglo-Saxon name, which we never hear of elsewhere, plus a normal ending for an Anglo-Saxon town. To be honest, I would say the basic answer is we really don't know. As I say, this other explanation for the Cotswolds is the region of Cuda, or this deity that was mentioned very briefly. But it would be just speculation. I'd be pulling things out of the air to say we really could prove anything there.
Yeah, no, it's very difficult to do with that sort of linguistics, sadly. Yeah. Would be nice to. But another question on a completely different subject. It's quite an intriguing one. I'm not sure about this one myself. It was reported in 2014 that archaeologists found remnants of a large complex, possibly a palace, under Old Sarum. Has there been any findings since? I don't remember that at all.
Yeah, this is... I have actually. I'll briefly reshare again. Just give me a second.
Okay.
Ooh.
Yeah, you had a beautiful overhead view, a drone view, or aerial photograph of Old Sarum, which is very clever.
This is all based on a survey that was done by Southampton University in 2014. It's a geophysics survey. I don't think it was much extensive digging, if anything, within the motte there. Right. Picture. There we go. So yes, this is a geophysical survey of the site. So what you're looking at in the top picture
not on our screens, I'm afraid.
Oh, sorry. I don't know what that is. Let's try sharing again. I'll try talking while I do both. So it's a geophysical survey which involves magnetometry and resistivity, looking at what's under the ground here. And you can see sort of ground plans of places. I'm going to shut that down without hopefully destroying anything. And what you can see is basically the lines of buildings when you're under the ground that are still buried under the ground. Sorry. And what they found was we had from the written sources assertions that there was a town here, but it was usually assumed to be very small, not very impressive, and a large part of it outside the site. What the geophysics showed, I am struggling to get it here. I'll be with you.
The power of words, painting a picture for us.
Yes, I'll just be very evocative. What it showed was there was actually in that very green and empty bit. Sorry, it's just there's something obscuring it, and I don't want to delete the entire app. What they showed was there's much more going on in the center of the site than we used to think. I'm going to not fight with that because I think if I press that
you
X,
mean the part that's then covered by the Motte and Bailey, or?
It's below the Motte and Bailey, so it's on that wider outer bit. And on the original picture, you could see there were two sort of banks cutting across between the inner Bailey, where the castle is, and the outer Bailey of the which is the original ramparts of the Iron Age hill fort that had been beefed up. And that is filled with lots and lots of little walls and houses. And in one part of that, one section of the walls there, you can see a much larger complex of buildings. I wouldn't say necessarily a palace. We do have palaces there. There's a big courtyard house from the 12th century that was in the castle. And there's the bishop's palace that is associated with Roger of Avranches, who's the main architect, if you like, in 1100 to 39 of the buildings there. I've seen it described as defensive. I've been to a talk by Alex Langlands, who's the guy doing the current survey. I had a brief look when I heard about this question at their monograph on it. I couldn't see any reference to palace there in the new site. That's not to say it isn't. It is big, but I'm not sure of the necessity for one there, given the other buildings. And without excavation, it's very hard to say. And I don't think there's been any sort of penetration of the ground there.
No, excellent. Okay, well, something to look out for. Hopefully, some more information coming about that at some point in time. Pavel Krupa has asked us, is it known why the major site at Stonehenge was not located around Bath with its springs, which should have been there and known about in the same time as Stonehenge was built? Which is it's always difficult to know why something isn't placed somewhere.
Yes. Yeah, and indeed, there may be things that we're missing in that area, but these are primarily a feature of the chalk zones of Wessex. And there's a bit of a different tradition going on in the area around Bath. Bath's at the fringe of what in the early period was a zone that overlaps with the sort of Severn Cotswold tradition. So that tomb that we saw at West Kennet, for example, that's an outlier of something that's much more common in that direction, less common in Wessex. But I think the explanation for Stonehenge is quite simple. It's like a lot of the other henge monuments. It's got two nice streams running either side of it. You've got the Winterbourne on one side, the Avon on the other side, which connect it with much wider areas where similar cultural sites are developing. And the chalk is easy to operate. It's easy to dig. And the sarsens are everywhere. The sarsen drifts are much less common as you get over towards Bath. I don't know historically where they sort of terminate in the Bath direction, but I think it's simply the combination of the access to the big sarsen stones, the pre-existence of the sites of these causewayed camps, and the existence of the streams and so on, there's no particular need for it to be in Bath elsewhere. Bath will be doing other things with its spring, and I don't know that we have any particular evidence of it being frequented at that time. I'm not sure when the earliest thing at Bath is. Certainly Iron Age, maybe I'd expect Bronze Age, but I don't know offhand what the very earliest is. So I hope that's some sort of answer. But yeah, the answer is basically that Stonehenge is where it needs to be. It's where all these things kind of end up, and Bath is doing, and the region around Bath is doing different things.
Excellent, excellent. And I think we have so many questions that have come in. There's been a talk that's really lit up the chat board here. There's a lot, but we've only really got time for one last one, and I'll give you a choice. Since there's been a lot of questions about King Arthur,
Right.
A real historical figure or not, and other ones, about sarsen stones, how they were formed, how the clusters were formed. So for your final answer, I give you the choice. Either of those two.
I think I can do both quite quickly, actually. The sarsen stones are basically solidified, calcified stones from what was effectively a kind of Florida Everglades. And you can see some of them, there were holes which still even have traces of roots from when they were this sort of muddy water, in this muddy water. Arthur, historically, he's a problem. I see no particular issue with Arthur existing. That's fine as far as I'm concerned. Certainly figures like him will have existed then. We've got reference to Ambrosius Aurelianus. In fact, we've got better reference to Ambrosius Aurelianus than him. He doesn't really appear much in the record until the 6th, 7th, 8th centuries, hundreds of years after. I mean, really, we're talking about the 8th to 9th centuries as when it really gets going. And that's centuries after he really would have existed, because he must belong to, based on what he's supposed to have done, around 500, AD 500. The connection with places like Glastonbury doesn't come until, well, the first references really to him and Glastonbury are actually in the Welsh chronicles from the Book of Llancarvan, which are the early 1100s. It's by the later 1100s that you get reference to him in there. And to be honest, the really boosted connection is because effectively their great church having burnt down in a terrible fire, the monks of Glastonbury, they kind of need a marketing strategy to pay for the rebuild. So amazingly, only a few years after the great success of Thomas the Becket Shrine for Canterbury, they discover this burial near the very oldest parts of the church at Canterbury, and there's a cross in there on which, in archaic writing, it says, "Here lies the renowned Arthur and Guinevere, his second wife," which is about as dubious an archaeological find, or as brilliant an archaeological find as you can get, because it tells you everything you want to know. And it says that they're buried in the Isle of Avalon. That is excavated, it's put in a shrine, and then a bit later on, under Edward I, it's translated into this very grand and dramatic shrine, because, of course, Edward is very big on this chivalric side to Arthur's reputation. But historically, you'd expect to find, even in the really dreadful sources we have for the 5th and early 6th centuries in Britain, some more reference to him if he were doing something in Wessex, because he would have encountered the early kings of what was then known as the Gewissae, who would become the kings of Wessex later on. And there are sufficient mentions in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle to hear something. It doesn't definitely say there isn't an Arthur. It just means that although there could have been an Arthur, he isn't demanded. But if he did exist, there would be a case for putting him in Wessex, because one possible explanation for the Battle of Mount Badon, the great cataclysmic battle of his reign, is that it might actually refer to Bath, which in its Anglo-Saxon form is known, at least early on, as Hot Badu. Forgive my Wessex pronunciation there, which basically just means hot bath. So Mons Badonicus could mean the Mount of Bath. So there are some very prominent hills just outside Bath. It could happen there. Yeah. But there are lots of other places that could lay claim to him as well. So I think, yeah, the basic answer is maybe, but do we need him? At least until a time of crisis, when of course he'll wake up and come and rescue us.
That's absolutely fantastic, Paul. We've kept you for a very long time. Thank you to everyone who joined us. We had a stable 215 or so by the looks of it for much of
Good
the
Lord.
presentation. It's wonderful numbers. Thank you for such an excellent presentation. I personally would love to get down to Wessex. Maybe not in the coming days. It looks like some bad weather's
Yes,
hitting
it's
soon,
looking a
but
bit. Yeah.
this July would be absolutely magnificent there, I think. So thank you very
Okay.
much indeed. Thank you
Yeah.
from
Hope
everyone,
to see you.
and
Yeah.
good night to all.
Thank you. Thank you.